Hey guys, today we're going to walk through how to shoot in manual mode on your camera. Now, manual mode can seem daunting, right? You just get your camera, you're excited to take pictures, you flip it to auto mode, and then you're taking the best pictures in the world. Not necessarily. So you can take even better pictures using manual mode because now you'll have complete control over the settings in your camera. I'm going to explain some of these general terms like aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and then we're gonna go see it in action and see how these things interact with each other. So stay tuned. Today we're gonna talk about how to shoot in manual mode. All right, manual mode. It's intimidating. I know it took me a while to shoot in manual after I got my first digital camera, but once I got the hang of it, it became all I wanted to do. Now when I grab a camera, I often forget there are even other settings on the camera like shutter speed priority or aperture priority. I'm always in manual mode because it's become second nature. So today my goal is to help you understand those settings within manual mode a little bit more so that you can get out there and start taking some incredible pictures, because then you have more control over your camera. So today I'm going to walk us through three terms and then we're going to see how they look while in action. So aperture, shutter speed, ISO. How do these three things interact with one another? Well, this is exactly where to start when you're looking at manual mode. So when I shoot manual mode, I start out with aperture. Now, basically all aperture is, it's how wide the tube is between the front of your camera lens to your camera sensor. Some camera lenses can start out at 1.2 aperture, which 1.2, while it's a small number, actually represents a very wide aperture, right? It's a lot of light can come through the tube and into the camera. While other camera lenses might start out at maybe f4, f5.6, which is a lot smaller of an aperture. And neither is bad, right? They all have their place when used well. And there are two things that the size that tube allows, right? Number one is the amount of light coming into the camera. If you have a really wide aperture, that means a lot of light can come into your camera. Meaning you can shoot in low light environments or something like that, like concerts or night photography or something like that. There's also another thing with a wide aperture. It gives you a shallower depth of field, which imagine you have your camera here, you're shooting, and this is your subject. The depth of field is basically how wide this focal plane is. So if you're shooting at a really wide aperture like f1.2, your focal plane is only going to be like that thin, right? It's really thin, which means your background is going to be blurred out and just beautiful. But if you increase your aperture, you're also increasing the focal plane in your depth of field, and you can get more of your subject in focus. And so that's why it's so important to understand aperture, because depending on what you're shooting, you're going to want to make sure that your aperture is set up right. If you're shooting portraits of somebody, a lot of people like to shoot at 1.2, which means your focal plane is like that. That just means you have to be that much more careful when getting eyes in focus and getting what you want in focus. Most lenses allow you to change your aperture. So let's say if you get a lens that's like a 1.2, you can always stop down, right, and go to like a 1.8 or a 2 or a 4, all the way up to like, I think it's f22 with some lenses. So aperture is important to know when it comes to properly exposing for your image, the amount of light you're into your camera and the depth of field. Next is shutter speed. In your camera is a shutter. It's basically this thing, when you press your camera button to take a picture, it opens and closes. And you can change the amount of time in which that shutter is actually open. So some cameras you can leave it open 30 seconds or longer, and other cameras you can, have it open and close faster than 1/8,000th of a second. And that's going to impact things, right? So let's think about this for a second. If your shutter is open for a longer period of time, that means there's more time for light to come into your camera and your sensor and to brighten up your image, which is great, right? We like a bright image, but be careful, because if your shutter's open too long, you'll get motion blur. And if that's not something that you want, then you don't want to leave your shutter open for that long. So think about your shutter speed. If you want to capture a still image where your subject is captured in time and it's nice and crisp and clear, you want a faster shutter speed, which means less light coming into your camera. So that's where you have to compensate with your aperture and your ISO, which we're going to talk about next. ISO, it's your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. And in digital cameras, you can change that sensitivity. You can bring it up and down. While it seems great to kind of have like a cheat sheet, right? You can increase your ISO and get a brighter image and make that shutter speed faster and all that. Sounds like a great plan, but here's the thing. When you increase your ISO, you create a noisier image. You're going to introduce digital noise into your picture. So when you zoom in to a picture that has really high ISO, you're going to see like weird colors like green, red, and blue that are all over your image, and you can't do anything to get rid of that in camera. You know, it's a challenge to remove that and have the image still look really nice. So ISO is one of those things. I always come to it last, and I try to keep it as close to 100 as I can, which is the lowest ISO setting that my camera has. So those are the three things. You have your aperture, which is your basically your diaphragm size, how much light can get into the camera and how shallow is your depth of field. You have your shutter speed, which is how fast your shutter opens and closes, which impacts the amount of light coming into your camera and impacts any motion blur you might want. And then there's ISO, which is basically the sensitivity that your camera has to light. And some cameras can handle ISO better than others. So my R6, I can bump that ISO up a lot and I still get a pretty crisp and clear image. But like the Canon RP, I can't bump the ISO up nearly as much before I get a unusable, noisy image. So those are the three things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's go see how these three things work in action and see how they interact with one another. So here I have a setup with a flower that I bought for my daughter for Valentine's Day, and we're gonna see how the three things, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, interact to take pictures of this flower and see how it changes the scene in different ways. Okay, so we have this flower picture here set up, and like I said earlier, the first thing I typically play with is the aperture. Now, let's just play with the aperture for a second. Let's bring it all the way down. Right, all the way down to 1.2. You'll see that this image has a lot of area that's blown out. It's overexposed. So how do we fix that? Well, first, we make sure that ISO is as close to 100 as possible. It's looking like a pretty well exposed image. Maybe I'll bring the shutter speed down. I'm using a tripod with a non-moving object, so I can slow that shutter speed down as much as I want. I focus, I take a picture, and boom. What do we got? We have this really cool image where that one bulb is in focus, but everything else is blurred out. It's kind of a really cool artistic photo. But what if I want more of the flower pot to be in focus? Well, easy, right? All we have to do is increase our focal plane by increasing our aperture. So maybe we want it at 5.6 and we'll just see what it looks like. Well, what do we have now? There's really nothing exposed. Everything is dark. So how do we fix that? Well, we can either increase our ISO or increase our shutter speed. Let's start out by increasing our shutter speed. Let's slow that thing down. We have our histogram here to show us what is in balance in terms of exposure. So like right here is pretty good. Let's focus on that one flower bulb, take a picture. What do we got? Okay, so more of the flower pot is in focus, right? So we compare this image to the last one. We'll see that the last one had a lot more area that was blurred out, had a bigger area that was blurred out. And this image, there's more in focus. We see the backgrounds coming through. Well, let's increase our aperture a lot. Let's go to 16 and just see what happens. Well, now we really need to slow our shutter speed down. So let's slow that thing down to like 3, maybe like 2.5 seconds, all right? So let's take that picture and see what happens. Okay, look at that. Everything's in focus, but I don't really like that, right? I don't like having the background in focus right now. It's kind of messy. So I wouldn't take this picture at f16 and probably stop it down to like f5. Let's play with the ISO for a second. So let's bring our aperture down to like 2, and let's keep our shutter speed. Let's pretend we have a moving object and our shutter speed is like 1/250th of a second. Well, now what do? We have to increase our ISO if we want to keep our aperture at 2 and our shutter speed at 250. Well, we have to increase our ISO. So let's increase this a little bit. Let's increase it like crazy just so I can show you what happens. Let's go to 10,000, which is just absurd. But let's compensate for that by increasing our shutter speed. All right, so that looks like a pretty well exposed image, and let's just take a picture and see what happens. All right, when we zoom in on this picture, we're gonna see that there's noise here that we don't necessarily want. We'll see that there's things there like really weird coloring. But just to give you a better example, let's go to 40,000. Let's really crank it and just see what happens. All right, this should give us a better example of why we shouldn't go to 40,000 on ISO. Yeah, there's a lot of noise in this picture and it's not as clear as it could be. So those are things you want to play with when you want to properly expose an image. I recommend using your histogram here. It just shows you how much of the low end and the high end is exposed and balanced in your picture. Having a more balanced photo is going to help you get a better exposed picture. Now, if you do all these things and it's still too dark, maybe you're shooting like a wedding and you have your shutter speed at 1/500th of a second, and maybe it's a group photo and you have to have it at like 5/6, and you obviously don't want your ISO to be that high, you want to keep it down low. Well, what other options do you have? It's a dark picture. Well, this is where you would need to add flash. We're not going to talk about this in this video, but having a speed light or an off-camera flash will help you expose your image and not have to deal with noise in your picture. So I hope that helps. Let's send it back over to Tyler. So that's how I approach shooting in manual mode. And as you can see, we can have a lot of flexibility over our image when we have complete control over our settings. So I encourage you, get out, play with manual mode as much as you can. Just pick something around your house, take pictures of it, play with the settings, and see how it changes things. That's really the one way to get good at shooting manual, is just play around with it. See how it changes your image and what the image says, what it portrays. You can make something super cool and artistic with a really blown out background, but that's not something you'd want to do if you're shooting something like landscape photography or real estate photography, because you want as much of your scene in focus as possible depending on what you're shooting. So get to know these settings. I hope this was helpful for you. If it was helpful, subscribe. Let me know what other kinds of content you want to see. I'm only making these because people are asking questions and I think it's fun to educate in this way. And again, most photographers will approach shooting in manual in different ways depending on their needs. The way I need it, it depends, right? If I'm shooting portraits, I'm going to prioritize how much of their face is in focus. I'm going to prioritize shutter speed. If I'm shooting a concert, I just want as much light in my camera sensor as possible. So I'm going to open up that aperture wide and see what happens. So hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm here. Follow me on Instagram, and I'll see you next time.